One of the first signs that a super empath is silently destroying an avoidance ego is something that, on the surface, looks incredibly simple. They stop chasing. Now, that may not sound dramatic. There's no argument, no emotional outburst, no final speech, no grand declaration that they are done. In fact, the avoidant often doesn't notice it immediately. That's because the super empath rarely withdraws in a loud or obvious way. Their change happens internally before it becomes visible externally. For a long time, the empath has been carrying the emotional weight of the relationship. They initiate conversations. They smooth over conflicts. They make excuses for distance. They offer understanding when they receive confusion. And perhaps most importantly, they continue investing emotional energy even when the return on that investment becomes smaller and smaller. The avoidant gradually becomes accustomed to this pattern. Psychologically speaking, human beings adapt quickly to whatever becomes predictable. What is repeated often enough starts to feel permanent. The avoidant begins to assume that no matter how distant they become, no matter how many mixed signals they send, the empath will still be there. Not because they consciously think this way, but because their experience keeps reinforcing the belief. And then something changes. The super empath reaches a threshold. This threshold is rarely caused by a single event. It is usually the result of accumulated disappointment, hundreds of small moments, unanswered messages, emotional inconsistency, repeated cycles of connection and withdrawal. Eventually, the empath sees a truth they have been resisting. Their love cannot compensate for someone else's unwillingness to engage. This realization creates a shift. Instead of asking, "How can I make this relationship work?" they begin asking, "Why am I carrying this alone?" That question changes everything. The empath stops pursuing. They stop monitoring the avoidance moods. They stop trying to decode confusing behavior. They stop volunteering emotional labor that is never reciprocated. What's fascinating is that they often do this without anger. And that is exactly why it impacts the avoidant so deeply. Most avoidants know how to handle emotional reactions. They know how to respond to pressure, criticism, or demands. In many cases, those situations reinforce their existing defenses. But calm detachment is different. Calm detachment offers nothing to push against. The empath is no longer fighting for attention. They are no longer trying to convince. They are no longer negotiating for basic emotional availability. They simply redirect their energy elsewhere. From a psychological perspective, this creates what is known as a disruption of expectation. The avoidance internal model of the relationship suddenly stops working. The person who is always available is no longer available. The person who consistently reached out becomes quiet. The emotional safety net they unconsciously relied upon begins to disappear, and with that comes discomfort. Not necessarily because they have lost control over the empath, but because they are forced to confront a reality they have been avoiding. The relationship was sustained by effort they did not fully appreciate. The silence starts asking questions that words never could. Why isn't this person chasing me anymore? Why do they seem different? Why do they appear calmer without me? For perhaps the first time, the avoidant experiences the absence of a person they assumed would always remain present. This is where ego enters the picture. The ego thrives on certainty. It likes predictable outcomes. It enjoys believing that people will continue playing the roles assigned to them. When the empath steps out of that role, the avoidant is confronted with uncertainty, and uncertainty has a way of exposing truths that comfort usually hides. The super empath doesn't need to punish the avoidant. They don't need revenge. They don't need to make speeches or prove a point. Their power comes from recognizing their own value and refusing to keep spending emotional energy where it is not respected. The moment they stop chasing, they stop teaching the avoidant that distance has no consequences. And that lesson can be more powerful than any argument. Because sometimes the loudest message a person can send is their silence, and sometimes the strongest move you can make is to stop running after someone who has never learned to walk beside you. Once a super empath stops chasing, something even more significant begins to happen. They stop looking to the avoidant for validation. This is where the dynamic undergoes a profound transformation. Because most unhealthy relationship patterns are not sustained by behavior alone. They are sustained by psychological dependency. One person becomes dependent on distance, while the other becomes dependent on approval. One avoids vulnerability, while the other constantly seeks reassurance that their efforts are enough. For a long time, the empath may not even realize they are doing this. Their intentions are usually sincere. They are not seeking validation in the obvious sense. They are not demanding compliments or begging for recognition. Instead, they are searching for signs. Small indicators that their love matters, a thoughtful message, a little more consistency, a deeper conversation, a moment of emotional openness. They convince themselves that if they can just reach the right level of understanding, patience, or compassion, the avoidant will finally meet them halfway. But beneath that hope is a dangerous assumption. The assumption is that their worth can be confirmed by someone else's response. And that is the trap. The moment your self-worth becomes connected to another person's ability to appreciate you, you hand them a level of psychological influence they never should have possessed. This is why so many empaths remain stuck in exhausting cycles. They are not merely attached to the person. They are attached to the possibility of being fully seen by that person. They believe that if they can earn enough love, enough commitment, or enough emotional availability, they will finally feel secure. Yet security that depends on another person is never truly security. It's permission, and permission can always be withdrawn. The super empath eventually reaches a point where this realization becomes impossible to ignore. They begin to understand that their value existed long before the avoidant entered their life, and will continue to exist long after. Notice what happens psychologically when this shift occurs. The empath no longer treats every text message as a measure of their importance. They no longer interpret emotional distance as proof that they are lacking something. They stop personalizing behavior that was never really about them in the first place. This creates a dramatic change in the energy of the relationship. Before, the avoidant occupied a position of psychological significance. Their attention felt meaningful. Their approval felt valuable. Their affection felt like a reward. Now that structure begins to collapse. The avoidance responses lose their power to define the empath's emotional state. And this is where the avoidance ego often becomes challenged in ways they never expected. Most people assume that ego is about arrogance. It is not. At its core, ego is about identity. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what role we play in the lives of others. Many avoidants unconsciously become accustomed to being the emotional center of gravity in the relationship. They are used to the empath adjusting, accommodating, understanding, and waiting. Not because they consciously demand it, but because the pattern has existed for so long. Then suddenly, the empath stops seeking confirmation. They stop needing reassurance. They stop treating the avoidant's attention as a scarce resource. The avoidant notices that something has changed. The conversations feel different. The emotional pressure is gone. The neediness they once expected has disappeared. Most importantly, the empath appears grounded, regardless of the avoidance behavior. That can be deeply unsettling. Why? Because the avoidant is now encountering a version of the empath that cannot be controlled through emotional scarcity. Think about that for a moment. Scarcity only works when someone believes they need what is being withheld. The moment the empath realizes their worth is independent of another person's approval, scarcity loses its influence. The avoidant can no longer occupy the same psychological position they once did, and this forces an uncomfortable confrontation with reality. The empath was never chasing validation because they were weak. They were chasing it because they cared. But now they have learned the difference between caring for someone and depending on someone to define their value. That distinction changes everything. Philosophically, this is one of the most important lessons any person can learn. Freedom begins the moment your self-respect becomes an internal decision rather than an external negotiation. The super empath does not become cold. They do not become selfish. They do not stop loving. What changes is that their love is no longer offered as a trade for acceptance. It becomes an expression of who they are rather than a request to be chosen. And when someone reaches that level of emotional independence, they become extraordinarily difficult to manipulate, control, or diminish. Because the strongest person in any relationship is not the one who needs the least love. It is the one who remembers their worth even when love is absent. As the super empath stops chasing and stops seeking validation, a third transformation begins to emerge. And this is often the moment that creates the deepest disruption in the avoidance worldview. The super empath starts setting firm boundaries, without anger, without drama, and without the emotional explosions that people typically associate with conflict. This is important because most people misunderstand what a boundary actually is. A boundary is not a threat. It is not punishment. It is not an attempt to control another person's behavior. A boundary is simply a declaration of what you will and will not participate in. The problem is that many empaths spend years confusing boundaries with rejection. They fear that if they become too firm, they will appear selfish. If they say no, they might hurt someone. If they stop tolerating unhealthy behavior, they might lose the relationship altogether. So they compromise. Then they compromise again and again, until what began as compassion slowly turns into self-abandonment. This happens more often than people realize. The empath tells themselves they are being understanding. They tell themselves they are being patient. They tell themselves that love requires sacrifice. And, to a certain extent, that is true. Every meaningful relationship requires sacrifice. But there is a profound difference between sacrificing for a relationship and sacrificing yourself for a relationship. One strengthens connection. The other destroys identity. The super empath eventually recognizes this distinction. They begin to understand that endless tolerance is not the same thing as unconditional love. In fact, excessive tolerance often enables unhealthy dynamics to continue far longer than they should. This realization changes how they respond to the avoidant. Instead of explaining the same hurt repeatedly, they simply stop accepting the behavior. Instead of arguing about inconsistency, they refuse to engage with it. Instead of demanding respect, they start requiring it. Notice how different this is from the emotional patterns that usually exist in these relationships. Before, the empath might have spent hours trying to communicate their feelings, hoping the avoidant would finally understand. Now, they communicate through action, and action is much harder to ignore than words. Psychologically, this creates a unique challenge for the avoidant. Avoidant individuals often become highly skilled at managing emotional conversations. They know how to withdraw. They know how to create distance. They know how to delay difficult discussions. Sometimes they do this consciously, but often it is simply a learned survival strategy developed over years. What they are less prepared for is calm certainty. When the empath no longer argues, pleads, negotiates, or reacts emotionally, the avoidant loses the familiar dynamic they have relied upon. There is nothing to defend against, nothing to escape from, nothing to reinterpret. Only consequences. And consequences have a remarkable way of revealing reality. For example, imagine an avoidant repeatedly disappears whenever emotional intimacy increases. In the past, the empath may have waited patiently, hoping things would improve. But now the boundary is different. The empath decides that consistent communication is a requirement, not a preference. They do not issue ultimatums. They do not attack. They simply step back when the standard is not met. That shift forces accountability where excuses once existed. What makes this so powerful is that the boundary is enforced without hostility. Many people believe strength requires aggression. It does not. In fact, some of the strongest people you will ever meet are remarkably calm. They do not need to raise their voice because they have already made their decision. They do not need to convince anyone because they have already convinced themselves. The super empath reaches a point where their peace becomes more important than preserving a dysfunctional pattern. And this is often where the avoidant's ego begins to feel genuinely challenged. Why? Because the avoidant is no longer interacting with the version of the empath they once knew. The old version could be persuaded to stay despite repeated disappointments. The old version could be drawn back through occasional moments of affection. The old version was willing to negotiate standards that should never have been negotiable. Now, those options are gone. The empath is no longer asking for permission to have needs. They are no longer apologizing for expecting mutual effort. They are no longer treating basic respect as a privilege. From a philosophical perspective, this represents a profound act of self-respect. True maturity is not measured by how much discomfort you can endure. It is measured by your willingness to honor your values even when doing so costs you something. And boundaries always cost something. Sometimes they cost convenience. Sometimes they cost comfort. Sometimes they cost relationships that were never healthy to begin with. But what they give back is far more valuable. They give back self-respect. The avoidant may interpret these changes as distance. They may see them as resistance. They may even perceive them as rejection. But in reality, the super empath is not rejecting the avoidant. They are rejecting the version of themselves that believed love required endless self-sacrifice. And that is a transformation that changes every relationship moving forward. Because the moment you stop protecting other people's comfort at the expense of your own well-being, You stop living as a participant in your life and start living as its author. And the people who truly value you will never ask you to abandon yourself in order to keep them. After the super empath stops chasing, stops seeking validation, and begins enforcing healthy boundaries, there is one final shift that often has the greatest impact of all. They move forward. Not dramatically, not with bitterness, not with a desire to prove anything. They simply begin building a life that no longer revolves around the avoidant. And this is where the entire dynamic reaches its conclusion. Because for a long time, the avoidant may have assumed that the empath's attention would always remain available. Even if there were periods of distance, conflict, or emotional disconnection, there was often an underlying belief that the empath would continue investing, continue hoping, and continue waiting. The avoidant becomes familiar with the idea that they occupy a permanent place in the empath's emotional landscape. Then one day, that assumption stops being true. The empath starts focusing on themselves. They reconnect with neglected goals. They invest in friendships. They develop new skills. They pursue meaningful work. They strengthen their physical and emotional health. Most importantly, they stop measuring their happiness by the status of a relationship that was never fully meeting their needs. At first glance, this may seem like a simple act of personal growth. Psychologically, however, it is much deeper than that. When people become trapped in unhealthy relational cycles, they often organize their lives around what is missing. Their attention becomes consumed by unanswered questions, unresolved emotions, and imagined future outcomes. They spend enormous amounts of mental energy trying to solve a problem that cannot be solved alone. The super empath eventually recognizes a fundamental truth. The energy spent trying to change another person can be redirected toward transforming yourself. And that realization becomes a turning point. Instead of asking, how do I make them choose me? They begin asking, what kind of life do I want to create regardless of who chooses me? That question changes the direction of their entire future. Because growth is impossible when all your attention is fixed on someone else's potential. Growth begins when your attention returns to your own reality. This is where many avoidants experience something unexpected. They notice the empath is no longer emotionally anchored to them. The conversations are different. The energy is different. The emotional dependence is gone. The empath appears lighter, stronger, and more grounded. What makes this particularly challenging for the avoidant's ego is that the empath's happiness no longer depends on the avoidant's participation. Think about that carefully. For years, the avoidant may have represented a goal, a mystery, or an emotional destination in the empath's mind. Now the empath has discovered fulfillment outside of that pursuit. And when someone stops needing what they once desperately wanted, they become fundamentally different. The avoidant begins to see evidence of this change everywhere. The empath is pursuing opportunities, building confidence, creating experiences, expanding their world, living with purpose. Suddenly, the person who once seemed focused almost entirely on the relationship has become focused on life itself. This often triggers reflection, not because the empath is trying to create jealousy, not because they are playing games, but because genuine growth has a way of highlighting what was previously taken for granted. There is an important philosophical principle at work here. Human beings rarely appreciate permanence. We tend to value things most when we realize they were never guaranteed. The avoidant may have assumed that the empath's patience was endless, that their understanding was limitless, that their loyalty would remain available regardless of circumstance. When the empath moves forward and genuinely embraces life beyond the relationship, those assumptions are challenged. And challenge is uncomfortable for the ego. The ego prefers certainty. It prefers familiar roles. It prefers predictable outcomes. But reality is different. Reality reminds us that every relationship is voluntary. Every connection is a gift. Every person's presence is a choice. The super empath eventually understands this at a profound level. They stop trying to force outcomes. They stop trying to convince people to meet them where they are. Instead, they invest their energy where growth, respect, and reciprocity already exist. And this is why their transformation becomes so powerful. The avoidant expects heartbreak, they expect anger, they expect resentment. What they often do not expect is peace. There is something deeply unsettling about watching someone become genuinely happy without the thing they once believed they needed. Because that happiness serves as evidence of a truth many people spend years avoiding. Fulfillment does not come from being chosen by one specific person. It comes from choosing yourself often enough that your life no longer depends on anyone else's decision. And that is the final lesson of the Super Empath's journey. Their greatest power was never their ability to love an avoidant. It was their ability to stop abandoning themselves in the process. Because the moment you build a life that reflects your worth, your values, and your purpose, you become impossible to diminish. And the people who failed to appreciate you are left, staring at the evidence of everything they overlooked.